Violet Harmon handed the keys to the house on Sycamore Road to the man from the bank, and he thanked her in the practiced voice of someone who had done this before and would do it again before the week was out. The bank had no interest in what those keys represented. It did not want to hear about the 2 mortgages taken out while Arthur was in treatment, or the retirement savings drawn down one careful withdrawal at a time, or the medical credit account that had climbed past any reasonable point of return. She was 68 years old. She walked out the front door on a Wednesday morning in March with 1 cardboard box and $7.12 in the pocket of her Goodwill coat, the change from Arthur's last prescription. What she did with that money, everyone who heard about it said, was either brave or foolish. Most said both. She drove to a county auction in the Shenandoah Valley and bought, for exactly $7, a farmhouse the county had condemned 6 years earlier. No real roof. No floor that would hold a person's weight. No heat, no water, no paved road past the first bend. The building had been sitting empty since before the last owner died and left no one behind to claim it. And what she built there, over the 14 months that followed, was not what anyone expected, least of all Violet herself. Because beneath the rotted floorboards of that farmhouse, under planks that had not been lifted in over 100 years, she found something that the bank and the county and every person who had quietly stopped calling could never have put a number on. And when the same man who had taken her keys drove back up that dirt road with a number written on a piece of paper, she told him to keep it. She already had everything she needed. $7. That is what it cost to begin again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The house on Sycamore Road had been built in 1959 by a man named Gerald Patton, who had done most of the framing himself over 2 summers. The bones were good. The rooms were modest in the way that houses from that era tended to be, built for people who expected to live in them rather than sell them. A kitchen that faced east and caught the morning light. A living room with a brick fireplace that drew cleanly even in February's worst weeks. A back porch that looked out over the yard Arthur had spent 3 decades slowly improving without ever quite finishing, which had never bothered either of them. Violet and Arthur moved to Sycamore Road in the spring of 1985. The walnut tree Arthur planted their first autumn was now broader than the porch railing it shaded. The hardware store 4 blocks down had closed, spent a year as a picture framing shop, and then gone dark entirely. The Prestons, who had lived directly across the street and knocked on the door with a fruit basket the week Violet and Arthur arrived, were both gone. Their house had changed hands 3 times. There was a basketball hoop in the driveway now, and 2 teenage boys she had never properly met. The neighborhood had rearranged itself around the house the way the world rearranges itself around the things it does not quite take. Violet had spent 38 years learning Sycamore Road the way you learn a person you share your days with. She knew which window stuck after a week of rain and needed a particular kind of persuasion to open. She knew the sound the water heater made at 5 in the morning, that low occasional knock that meant it was working and could be trusted to keep working. She knew the way the afternoon light fell across the kitchen counter in late October, lower and slower than in August, landing on whatever was sitting there with a quality that made ordinary things look like they had been placed with intention. She had cooked more meals in that kitchen than she had ever thought to number. She had raised 2 children inside those rooms. Daniel had grown up in the back bedroom, with the sloped ceiling he complained about every year until he left for school in Roanoke, and then mentioned with something like warmth every time he came home for Thanksgiving. Pauline had claimed the front bedroom from the age of 7 and repainted it so many times over the years that the walls had a slight texture to them, a history you could feel if you pressed your palm flat against them. She had argued with Arthur in the living room and made up with him in the hallway. She had sat beside him at the kitchen table in the early mornings before either of them was ready to speak, when the coffee was enough and the silence between them was the easy kind that only belongs to people who have been together long enough to have earned it. She had loved this house the way you love something that has been the container of your life. Not the stuck window or the water heater's morning knock, but the accumulated weight of what had happened inside those walls. The ordinary Wednesdays and the difficult Decembers and the Sunday mornings when Arthur made biscuits with more conviction than technique and nobody mentioned it, because nobody needed to. The morning the bank came, she was at the kitchen sink rinsing the breakfast dishes. She heard the car pull up with the particular sound of a vehicle stopping deliberately in front of a house rather than simply passing through. And she set a cup down on the counter and stood still for a moment with her hands still wet. She already knew. The letters had been arriving since October, each one slightly more final than the one before, the language shifting in the careful way that official language shifts when options have run out. She had kept them in a folder in the kitchen desk labeled, in her own handwriting, bank, as if a plain name could hold it at a manageable distance. It had not held. Arthur Harmon had been a high school history teacher for 31 years, which had given him, among other things, an unusual patience with things that took a long time to make sense. He retired at 62 with the particular lightness of a man who had spent 3 decades explaining to other people's children why the past mattered and was now free to spend his own hours however he chose. What he chose was the backyard. He had always kept a vegetable garden on Sycamore Road. A modest one, tomatoes, pepper plants, the green beans Violet actually used. But in retirement, the garden had moved in a direction neither of them had anticipated. Through a library book and then a local agricultural extension meeting, he had become interested in old apple varieties. Not the ones you found at the grocery store. The ones that had existed before grocery stores decided what an apple should look and taste like. He took up grafting in his late 60s and learned it the way he had learned most things, slowly, seriously, with a willingness to be poor at something for as long as it took to get less poor. By the time he died, there were 14 apple trees in the yard behind the house on Sycamore Road, each one a different variety, each one labeled in his handwriting on a small aluminum tag he had stamped himself. Roxbury Russet, Newtown Pippin, Colville Blanc de Hiver, which he pronounced with an accuracy that had required sustained effort and which made Violet laugh every time, not at him but alongside him, a distinction he always appreciated. He kept notebooks, a habit from the classroom that had survived retirement without anyone asking it to. He recorded grafting dates, survival rates, flavor notes, and letters exchanged with other growers across the state. The notebooks lived on a shelf in the garage beside his tools. They were among the things Violet had found hardest to know what to do with after he was gone. She had not decided. They were still on the shelf when the bank came. Arthur was a quiet man in the way that people who spend years observing others sometimes become quiet. He was not withdrawn. He preferred listening to talking, which had made him a better teacher than most and a better husband than he ever fully credited himself for being. His humor arrived late and landed when you had nearly stopped expecting it. You had to be paying attention, and Violet had been paying attention for a long time. She had fallen in love with him at 27 at a dinner party neither of them had wanted to attend. He had spent most of the evening listening to a man across the table talk about something Violet could no longer remember. And then, in the pause that opened when the man finally stopped, Arthur had said one quiet sentence so precisely accurate that Violet had looked at him properly for the first time all evening and understood that this was someone she wanted to keep in her life. She had been keeping him in her life for 41 years after that evening, talking and not talking in the rhythm of people who have found someone they can be genuinely silent with. Their life on Sycamore Road had settled into patterns that neither of them had planned, but that both had come to depend on. Saturday mornings were for the farmer's market on Court Street. Wednesday evenings were for the British cooking program they had watched together since 2003, a show neither of them could have explained choosing, but which they had never missed a season of. Thursday afternoons, in the growing months, Arthur was in the yard with his grafting knife and his current notebook. Violet was usually on the back porch with a book, near enough to talk without needing to. Daniel called every Sunday evening from Portland, practical and warm in the careful way of a son who had learned early that both qualities were necessary. Pauline came home twice a year from Charlotte and filled the house with a particular energy Violet recognized as the version of herself she had been at 38, still moving fast, still certain the important thing was just ahead of where she currently was. Violet had watched her children become people she genuinely liked, which she understood was not guaranteed. She had watched Arthur settle into retirement with more ease than most men managed that transition. She had watched the apple trees in the yard grow taller each spring, read his notebooks on the mornings when she needed to feel near to something of his, and thought, in the ordinary way of someone who has no particular reason to think otherwise, that this was what the years ahead would look like. The ordinary days, and the Saturday markets, and the Wednesday evenings, and Arthur in the yard with his knife and his careful records. She had not been bracing for anything. She had been living, which is what you do when you do not yet know what is coming. The cough started in January of 2022, a dry, persistent thing that did not resolve the way coughs resolve. Arthur mentioned it once, in the way he mentioned things he did not want to make large. Violet noticed it the way she noticed things she did not yet want to name. For 3 weeks, they both let it stay small. Then came the morning he mentioned it to their doctor, and the doctor's face changed, and nothing after that stayed small. The diagnosis arrived on a Thursday afternoon in September, delivered by a pulmonologist named Dr. Mehta, who had the manner of someone who had given difficult news enough times to know that the way you gave it mattered. Stage 3. Non-small cell. The words landed in the room the way heavy things land, without drama, with weight. Arthur reached for Violet's hand before she reached for his. The treatment plan was outlined in the same appointment, which Violet would later think of as a mercy, the immediate presence of something to do, somewhere to direct attention. Surgery was not the first option. Chemotherapy and targeted radiation were. There is also a clinical trial at the University of Virginia Medical Center in Charlottesville, 90 minutes east, that Dr. Mehta mentioned with a particular tone Violet recognized. The tone of someone telling you where the better odds were, without saying so directly. She looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at her. She told Dr. Mehta they wanted to hear everything about the trial. The clinical trial was not covered. The standard treatment was covered partially. The gap between what insurance paid and what the next 18 months would actually cost was a number that required sitting with for 2 full evenings before she and Arthur could discuss it without one of them having to stop. They discussed it. They made decisions. They refinanced the house on Sycamore Road, a process that took 3 weeks, and produced a folder of paperwork she kept beside the bank folder in the kitchen desk. They sold the second car, the newer one, and kept the 2009 Civic that Arthur had always preferred anyway. They sold the bedroom furniture from Daniel's old room and the dining table they had bought in 2008 to replace a table that had nothing wrong with it. They sold 14 apple tree saplings Arthur had grafted over the previous 2 winters, a transaction that had required, Violet noticed, 2 days of sitting quietly in the yard before he was ready to do it. He did it. They never discussed it again. The trial gave them 16 months. The months were hard in the specific way that treatment months are hard. Not one continuous difficulty, but a rhythm of difficulty and recovery and hope and setback that established its own exhausting pattern. Good weeks, and then a week that undid them. Numbers that moved in the right direction and then stopped moving. Arthur remained, throughout, more himself than the disease wanted him to be. He kept his notebooks in the early months, recording less but recording. He watched the apple trees from the back porch on the days when he could not stand at them, and told Violet once, in early spring, that the Colville Blanc looked like it was going to be a good year. It was a good year for the Colville Blanc. Arthur died in November, on a Tuesday morning, in the bedroom where the light came through at an angle they had both always liked. Violet had been beside him. She had been beside him through everything that preceded it, which had required the kind of sustained composure that does not come naturally to anyone, and that she had built, day by day, out of the necessity of being the person Arthur needed her to be in rooms where one of them needed to be afraid quietly so the other could afford to be less so. Arthur had known she was doing it. He had told her once, during a long night in the hospital in Charlottesville, that he could tell and that he was grateful and that she could stop pretending he was not frightened because he knew she already knew. She had stopped pretending. They had sat together in the particular honesty of that, and it had been, strangely, one of the better nights of the 16 months. The grief afterward was its own country with its own climate and no map she had been given in advance. She had lost both her parents. She had attended the funerals of friends and neighbors and understood loss as a general territory. Losing Arthur was different in the way that losing a 41-year companion is always different from anything else, Not only his absence, but the absence of the version of herself that had existed in relation to him. The part of her that had been defined by being known by someone. She gave herself November to not function. She stayed in the house, accepted the casseroles the neighbors brought, spoke to Daniel on Sundays and Pauline twice a week, and deflected questions about what she intended to do next because she did not know and could not manufacture an answer she did not have. The bank folder in the kitchen desk grew through November and into December. The letters resumed their arrival with the regularity of letters that have a schedule to keep, each one slightly more final. She read each one and filed it, and made herself a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking out of the yard where Arthur's apple trees were bare and winter gray against the fence line. She called Daniel in late January. The conversation was difficult in the way practical conversations are difficult when the practical conclusion is one neither person wants to reach. She called Pauline afterward. That conversation was different, softer, and harder in its own way, because Pauline's grief was real and close, and sometimes Violet found herself managing two losses in a single phone call. She thanked them both. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. There was no version of keeping the house that was also a version of remaining solvent. She had looked at it from every angle available to her. The bank extended a 30-day period to arrange her affairs. She spent those 30 days moving through the rooms the way you move through something you are memorizing. She let herself do this. She had learned, in the preceding 16 months, to let herself do things that had no practical purpose but that were necessary all the same. The 30 days the bank gave her to arrange her affairs passed in a way she had not anticipated. She had expected to feel the countdown quality of them. Instead, they carried a different weight, the weight of something already decided, moving at the pace of paperwork. She sorted through 38 years of accumulated living, a process that produced less sentimentality than she had expected and more physical exhaustion than she had prepared for. What to keep? What to let go? The calibration of what mattered when matter was now measured by what fit in a car. On the last night, she sat at the kitchen table with a box of photographs and went through them slowly. Arthur at 31, standing in front of the school where he had just been hired, with the particular expression of a man who has gotten something he wanted and has not yet begun to worry about deserving it. Arthur and Violet at their wedding on the back steps of her parents' house in Harrisonburg. The children at various ages. Daniel and Pauline squinting at the camera on some summer afternoon she could not date exactly. Arthur and Pauline at her college graduation. Violet and Arthur at the Saturday Farmers Market on Court Street. In a year, she recognized by the quality of the light without being able to name it. She packed the photographs carefully and set the box beside the door. In the morning, she put on the good wool coat, carried the box to the front porch, and waited. The two men from the bank arrived at 9. They were professional and careful with her, which she appreciated. One of them offered to carry the box. She said no thank you. She walked down the front path, through the gate, and she did not look back at the house on Sycamore Road because she had done her looking across the 30 days that preceded this one. In her coat pocket, $7.12. The change from Arthur's last prescription. She had picked it up out of habit 4 days after he died and had only understood the full weight of it when she got home and stood in the kitchen with the paper bag in her hands, and there was no one to give it to. She had kept it in this coat ever since. Through the grief and the bank letters and the 30 days of moving through the rooms. $7.12, the last transaction of a life she had built with someone who was no longer here. She had been staying at the Skyline Motor Lodge on Route 34 for 9 days when she saw the notice. The lodge left a copy of the Augusta County Courier near the ice machine each week, a free local paper that ran church announcements and classified listings and local news that larger papers had stopped covering years ago. She picked it up out of habit, the alternative being the television she had been leaving off. The notice was on the 3rd page. Government property disposal auction. Augusta County surplus and condemned parcels. Saturday, June 7th, County Fairgrounds Building D. It listed 11 properties in the clipped language of official records. Parcel numbers, acreage, minimum bids. The last entry was different from the rest. Parcel 11, approximately 3.1 acres with structure. Hollow Creek Road, approximately 9 miles northwest of Waynesboro. Structure condemned by County Order, 2018. No minimum bid established. Property classified non-recoverable. Access road unpaved and seasonal. No utilities connected. County records note structure as beyond reasonable rehabilitation. She read it 3 times. No minimum bid. Non-recoverable. She had spent enough years reading official language to know what those 2 things together meant. Nobody had wanted it. It had passed through every available process without finding a taker, and this auction was the county's last formal gesture before whatever happened to land that no one would claim, even for nothing. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket beside the $7.12. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She sat on the edge of the motel bed for a long time. She was 68 years old with $7, a motel room, eating through her Social Security at a rate she tracked daily, and 2 children who would help if she asked. She had not asked. What she was looking for, she had come to understand, was something that belonged to her. Not borrowed, not temporary. Hers. A condemned farmhouse on a dirt road 9 miles from town was not, by any sensible measure, an answer. She had learned in the preceding 2 years that the sensible measure was not always the right one. She arrived at the fairgrounds 40 minutes early. Building D held about 50 people, farmers, developers, the regulars who attended these events and had opinions about everything on the list. She registered, received bidder car number 22, and found a seat near the back. The man beside her, a heavy-set retired contractor named Gus, offered running assessments of each property without being asked. She thanked him without indicating what she planned to do with any of it. The first 10 parcels moved quickly. She watched the room learn its rhythms, the way the serious bidders held themselves still until the last moment, the way casual participants fell away early. Parcel 11 came last. The auctioneer, a compact man named Hank, looked at his clipboard when he reached it with the expression of someone confirming what he already knew the outcome would be. Parcel 11, he said, 3.1 acres on Hollow Creek Road. Farmhouse structure, approximately 900 square feet. Condemned 2018. No minimum bid established. We'll open the floor. The room produced a quiet that had a shape to it. Any bids? Hank said. Violet raised her card. The room turned to look at her. $7, she said. Hank wrote it down with the professional neutrality of a man who had seen everything and was paid to treat all of it the same. Gus beside her went very still. $7. Going once, Hank said. Going twice. The room held its breath. Sold to bidder 22. She walked to the front table, counted out $7 from her coat pocket, signed the transfer paperwork, and received in return a deed copy, a hand-drawn map, and a key on an old iron ring. Dark with age. The kind of key that had not turned a lock in a very long time. She drove out to Hollow Creek Road that same afternoon. The map was hand-drawn in blue ballpoint on the back of a county property form, and it was accurate in the way hand-drawn maps are accurate. Generally right, specifically unreliable. She found Route 34 easily enough, then Hollow Creek Road, which began as 2 lanes and narrowed by degrees until it became 1 lane with occasional turnouts cut into the shoulder for passing. The asphalt ended without announcement 2 miles in, becoming packed gravel, and then the gravel thinned to tire tracks pressed into the grass, and then even those disappeared at a rusted gate set between 2 fence posts that leaned toward each other like they were conferring. She parked, got out, and walked the last quarter mile. She had told herself on the drive to be realistic. She had read the county's language. Condemned. Non-recoverable. Beyond reasonable rehabilitation. She had tried to hold those words at their full weight so that what she found would not be worse than what she had prepared for. She had not been realistic enough. The farmhouse had been, at some point, a sound and honest structure. She could see that. The stone foundation, set into the hillside with the care of someone who understood what foundations were for, had held. The chimney on the north end still stood straight. The corner posts and the ridge beam still described the shape of the house that had once known what it was. But time, in a decade of no one caring, had done considerable work. The porch across the front had pulled away from the main structure and dropped at an angle into the overgrowth, like something that had given up and sat down. The roof had failed across the middle section, leaving a gap open to the sky above what had been the main room. 2 of the 4 windows were gone entirely. The door hung from one hinge at a backward angle, the frame swollen and split. She stood at the gate for a moment. Then she walked toward it. Inside was a different kind of reckoning. The floor had given way in 3 places, the boards rotted through where rain had been coming in through the failed roof long enough to do real damage. The walls were standing but streaked dark with years of water finding its way in and staying. The smell was the smell of a sealed place that had been unsealed too late. Damp and old and close in a way that was not quite decay, but was not far from it. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked up through the gap in the roof at the late afternoon sky, and she held the full weight of what she had done without flinching from it. She was 68 years old. She had $7.12 less than she had started the day with. She had a condemned farmhouse on a dirt road in Augusta County with no intact roof, no water, no heat, and nothing that could honestly be called a plan. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back to the car, retrieved the box of photographs and the wool blanket from the back seat, carried them inside, and set them on the most solid section of floor she could find, near the north wall beside the fireplace. She sat down beside the box and found the photograph of Arthur at the Court Street Farmers Market. She held it in both hands in the fading afternoon light. The first night was not something she could have accurately anticipated even if she had tried. She gathered dry timber from the collapsed porch, enough for a fire, and built it in the stone fireplace on the north wall, which drew well. A small mercy she noted with something close to gratitude. She had the wool blanket, 3 granola bars from the glove compartment, and half a bottle of water. She ate slowly, sat close to the fire, and listened to the sounds of the property moving through the open roof and the empty window frames. Wind in the tree line above the house. The structure settling in the dropping temperature. Somewhere out in the darkness, an animal she could not identify, but that was clearly not close. She was not afraid. She noticed this the way you notice something unexpected. She was in a state past the place where fear tends to live, somewhere further in, where things reduce to their actual components. She had a fire. She had a blanket. She had enough food for the night. The morning would require decisions, and she would make them when it arrived. She thought about calling Pauline. She held the phone for a few minutes with Pauline's name on the screen, then put it back in her coat pocket. It was not pride. She had moved some distance past pride in the preceding months. It was something else, a sense that this particular night was one she needed to stay fully inside of rather than be retrieved from. That calling would solve the immediate discomfort in a way that prevented her from understanding something she needed to understand about herself. The fire burned toward coals. She added the last of the timber and watched it catch. She thought about Arthur's apple trees back on Sycamore Road, bare through a winter she had not been present for. Whether anyone had read the aluminum tags in his handwriting. Whether the new owners had any idea what they had inherited in that yard. She would not think about that right now. She pulled the blanket closer and thought instead about the 3 things that needed to happen first in the right order. Weatherproofing the open section of roof, because rain would accelerate every other problem. A reliable water source, because 9 miles from town was not a distance she could manage on a daily basis. A sleeping arrangement that was not the floor, because she was 68 years old and the floor was going to have consequences she would feel for days. 3 things. She could work on 3 things. The sky above the gap in the roof had begun to shift from black toward the particular deep blue that comes roughly 30 minutes before dawn. She watched it and felt, without being able to explain it fully, that the shift was not only in the sky, that something was ending in a broader sense than just the night. She reached into the box and found the wedding photograph. Arthur and Violet on the back steps of her parents' house in Harrisonburg, both of them with the expressions of people who cannot see what is coming and are ready for it anyway. She had thought across the past several months that the readiness in that photograph was a kind of innocence, that they had been young and had not known enough to be properly cautious. She looked at it now in the pre-dawn light of a condemned farmhouse she had bought for $7, and she revised that thought. The readiness was the only rational response to a future you could not clearly see. You could be ready, or you could be stopped. Stopped was not a way forward. She put the photograph back in the box. She was about to pull the blanket tighter when something caught her eye at the base of the north wall, near the edge of the fireplace where the floor met the stone foundation. She had not noticed it in the fading light of the previous evening, and in the firelight it had been lost entirely. But in the growing gray of early morning, with the light coming through the gaps at a low flat angle, she could see it clearly. The floor near the north wall was not the floor. Something was beneath it. She leaned forward. She set the blanket aside and moved toward the north wall on her hands and knees, spreading her weight across the boards the way she had learned over the past few days to move across uncertain floor sections. The boards held. She reached the base of the fireplace and looked at what she had seen from across the room. It was a hatch, set flush into the planking, fitted so cleanly into the surrounding floor that in any other light it would have read as simply part of the surface. Iron hardware, old and dark, a recessed ring handle that lay flat when not in use. Around the perimeter, barely visible beneath decades of grime and settled dust, a careful bead of some kind of sealant, applied with attention, meant to keep whatever was inside separated from everything outside. She sat back and looked at it. She tried the ring handle. The hatch had no interest in opening. It had been sealed for a long time, and the wood had swollen into the frame over years and seasons until the two were effectively one. She did not have a pry bar. She looked around the room, found a length of iron from the collapsed window frame, worked it into the gap along the hatch's edge, and applied steady pressure. The hatch came up on the third attempt, with a sound that was less a creak than a release, the sound of something that had been held in one position for so long that changing it required a kind of permission. A smell came with it, cool and dry and faintly sweet. The smell of a sealed space that had been maintaining its own conditions undisturbed for a very long time. She brought her flashlight and shone it down. Stone steps, 7 of them, cut directly into the hillside the farmhouse had been built against. At the bottom, a packed earth floor, stone walls, a ceiling low enough that she would need to duck to stand. But wide, wider than she had expected, running beneath the full length of the north wall. She went down carefully, testing each step. The space was not empty. Along the west wall, on shelves built from chestnut planks fitted between iron brackets driven into the stone, sat rows of stoneware crocks with wax-sealed lids. 26 of them. She counted, each one sitting level and deliberate, each one with a paper label gone brown with age, but still legible in the narrow beam of the flashlight. She leaned in close to read the nearest one. Cherokee Trail of Tears Bean. The handwriting was careful and unhurried. Below it, a year, 1931. She stood up straight, or as straight as the low ceiling allowed. She moved along the shelf. Mortgage lifter tomato, bloody butcher corn, turkey craw bean, moon and stars watermelon, glass gem corn, Alabama blue collared. Each label in the same careful hand. Each one dated. The dates range from 1918 to 1959. 41 years of someone bringing something down these steps and setting it on a shelf with the intention that it would be found and used. Along the east wall, stacked with the same deliberate care, sat wooden boxes she recognized from photographs she had seen in library books. High bodies. Supers. A bellows smoker with a leather bellow still supple despite its age. Veils folded flat. A hive tool. Bee brushes. The equipment of someone who had kept bees and had put their tools away with the expectation of returning to them. The wood of the boxes was cedar. It had kept its character in the dry, sealed air, still fragrant in a faint way that reached her when she put her face close. On a low shelf beside the hive equipment sat a row of composition notebooks, 12 of them, their covers faded but intact. She took the first one and opened it with care. The date on the first page was April 1922. The handwriting was the same hand as the seed labels. The entry described a planting record, what had gone into the ground, in which field, on which date, and in what quantity. The notes were specific and unsentimental. Core germination rate, poor this year, frost damage likely. Save seed from the 5 strongest plants in the south field. Planted bean seeds from Edna Corley's line, 3rd generation. Flavor superior to anything I have bought. She sat down on the bottom step and read for a long time. The notebooks covered nearly 40 years of farming on this land. Planting records, harvest notes, weather observations, seed-saving decisions, made season by season with the careful logic of someone who understood that the seed you saved this year was the plant you grew next year and the year after, that the work was continuous and the knowledge accumulated or was lost depending entirely on whether someone wrote it down. There were notes on the bees, swarm dates, honey yields, winter losses, the particular temperament of individual colonies described with a familiarity that made clear their keeper had spent a great deal of time among them and paid attention to what he found there. The last entry was dated October 1961. It described the harvest, the seeds selected and sealed and shelved, the hives prepared for winter. It ended mid-page, as if the next entry had simply never come. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands. She thought about Arthur. Not the Arthur of the last months, but the Arthur of the Saturday farmer's market, standing at the Heritage grain table with the expression of someone encountering something he had not expected to find and was already trying to understand. The Arthur who had grafted 14 apple trees in the yard on Sycamore Road because he believed the varieties worth keeping were worth the effort of keeping them, who had recorded everything in notebooks on a shelf in the garage in the same careful handwriting for the same reason. She pressed her hand flat against the cool stone of the wall beside the shelves and held it there. She had bought 3.1 acres and a condemned farmhouse for $7. What she had actually bought, she was only now beginning to understand, was something someone else had spent 40 years carefully preserving against the possibility that the right person would eventually come down these steps and know what to do with it. She was not yet sure she was that person. She suspected she was going to find out. She climbed back up the stone steps and sat on the floor above the open hatch in the early morning light. And for the first time since she had walked out the front door on Sycamore Road, she felt the particular quality of stillness that is not emptiness, but its opposite, a fullness that had not been there the night before. 3 things first, then everything else. The first 2 weeks were an education in the difference between knowing something would be hard and experiencing the specific texture of that hardness. She drove into Waynesboro the morning after she found the hatch and used her Social Security deposit to buy a tarpaulin, basic tools, rope, 2 gallons of water, and a week's worth of food. She returned to Hollow Creek Road and began. What she discovered was that her body had opinions about sustained physical work that her mind had not consulted in advance. She went to sleep aching in places she had not known could ache. She woke to find that what she had completed the previous day was less than she had estimated, and what remained was more. She adjusted her estimates and continued. The roof tarp went up on day 3. Imperfect, but covering the open section well enough to change the interior of the farmhouse from a place where rain was an active threat to a place where it was merely a sound. The floor gaps she addressed with boards pulled from the collapsed porch, temporary and unbeautiful, but solid. The door she rehung properly on day 9, adjusting the frame by degrees until it opened and closed with the clean resistance of a door that fit. She was not good at any of it. She knew this clearly and did not pretend otherwise. She was getting less bad, which was the right direction. The stoneware Crocs and the notebooks occupied her evenings. She had found a county agricultural extension office in Waynesboro, and the woman who ran it, a careful and unhurried person named May, had spent 2 hours with Violet on a Thursday afternoon confirming what she had begun to suspect. The seeds in the Crocs were not merely old. Several of the varieties had been considered commercially extinct for decades. The Cherokee Trail of Tears bean, the glass gem corn, the moon and stars watermelon. May had used the word irreplaceable and then paused and used it again, as if once had not been adequate. The beekeeping notebooks were their own education. She read them alongside 2 library books on natural beekeeping and began to understand, slowly, the logic of what the notebooks described. The man who had kept these bees had understood his colonies the way Arthur had understood his apple trees, as living things with individual characters that rewarded sustained attention. She ordered 2 packages of bees from a supplier in the Shenandoah Valley in early July. They arrived on a Friday morning in ventilated boxes that hummed with a sound she had not expected to find so settling. She installed them with the care of someone performing a procedure they have read about many more times than they have practiced. Most of them stayed. She took this as encouragement. The first visitor arrived in August. Her name was Loretta, and she lived on the connecting road a mile down, and she had driven past the property 3 times before stopping with a jar of sourwood honey and the direct admission that she had been curious. She was 73 sharp, recently moved from Staunton to be nearer her son's family, and she had the quality Violet recognized immediately. Someone in the middle of figuring out what the next chapter looked like. She stayed 3 hours the first visit and returned the following Saturday with questions about the seeds. The second visitor came through Loretta. His name was Samuel, a recently retired schoolteacher from Harrisonburg who drove 40 minutes because Loretta had told him there was somewhere worth going. He sat in the garden for 2 hours, said very little, and left with the expression of someone who had received something without quite being able to name what it was. Violet had not planned any of this. Word moved the way it moves in small communities, through the particular channel of someone knowing someone who needed something and someone who had it. She found a letter on a Wednesday evening in September, 5 months after she had first walked up the hill to the farmhouse. She had been going through the box of photographs, not because it needed doing, but because she sometimes needed to hold them. She had handled the wedding photograph dozens of times. When she removed it from between its pieces of protective cardboard, something fell from behind it. A folded piece of paper. Her name on the outside in Arthur's handwriting. She sat very still. She unfolded it. He had written it 6 weeks before he died, in the last period when his hands had still been fully steady. Violet, I know how you carry things. You carry them inside, and you manage them, and you keep moving because keeping moving is what you know how to do. That is one of the things I have loved most about you, and also the thing I want to speak to directly. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to be inside the hard thing rather than always just ahead of it. The stopping is not weakness. You have never needed me to tell you what to do or who to be. You have always known both. You just sometimes need someone to tell you that you already know. There's a life waiting on the other side of this grief. I cannot see its shape, and neither can you yet, but I know it is there because I know you, and you have never failed to build something worth having from whatever you were given. Trust that. Trust your hands. Keep something alive. You will know what I mean when the time comes. All my love, Arthur. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held in both hands and let the grief come all the way through. She had not cried since the first week on Sycamore Road. She cried now, for Arthur and for the apple trees, and for the 41 years of Saturday markets and quiet mornings and the specific way he had of being present in a room without requiring anything from it. When it passed, she felt for the first time since November that he was not entirely gone. The person who had known her well enough to write those words at the moment she would need them most had left something of himself behind. It was in this land, in the notebooks on the shelf below, in the bees now settled in their cedar boxes at the eastern edge of the property. Keep something alive. She understood exactly what he meant. She looked at her hands. They were different than they had been 5 months ago. Rougher, more capable looking. The hands of someone who had been doing things and intended to keep doing them. Warren Cole arrived on a Thursday morning in October in the same silver sedan that had been parked in front of the house on Sycamore Road 19 months earlier. Violet saw it from the upper garden, where she and Loretta were doing the last of the fall planting, pressing garlic cloves into the turned earth at the spacing the notebooks recommended. She recognized the car before she recognized the man. The particular color of it. The particular way it sat at the bottom of the hill on the unpaved road, deliberate and out of place. She felt something in her chest when she saw it. She noted that the something was not fear, not even close to fear. She was curious about what he wanted and clear about what she would say. "I'll be a few minutes," she told Loretta. She walked down the hill. Warren Cole had aged in the way that men age when their work asks more of them than they had originally agreed to give. He got out of the car and looked up the hill at what the farmhouse had become, and something moved through his expression that took her a moment to read. It was not calculation. It was closer to recognition of something he had not expected to find. "Mrs. Harmon," he said. "Mr. Cole," she said. Warren Cole had heard enough of it, apparently, to drive 9 miles up a dirt road on a Thursday morning. He delivered his proposal with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that his time and other people's time were both finite. There were investors interested in the property. The seed collection, the land, the location. He named a number. It was a significant number. The woman who had walked off Sycamore Road with $7 in her coat pocket would have felt that number differently than the woman standing here now. She let him finish. She had learned in the preceding months to let people finish. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, not for effect, but because she was organizing what she wanted to say into the form it needed to take. "I appreciate you making the drive," she said. "I want to say something to you directly, so we understand each other." He waited. "When you came to Sycamore Road, I had spent everything I had keeping my husband alive. I understood you were doing your job. I have no grievance with you for that." She paused. "But I want you to understand what this place is, so there's no confusion between us." She looked at him steadily. "This is not a collection. It is not an asset. It is not potential waiting for the right investor." She looked up briefly at the farmhouse, at the sign at the gate, at the hives. "It is a working seed library. It is a place where people come to learn how to save what is worth saving. It is where I spend my mornings with my bees and my evenings reading notebooks written by a man who understood that knowledge disappears if nobody bothers to carry it forward." She paused once more. "You cannot buy that. Not any part of it." Warren Cole looked at her for a long moment. He was not a bad man. She had decided this watching his face across the conversation. He was a man who had spent a career reducing things to their transferable value and had perhaps been doing it long enough that the other kind of value had become genuinely difficult to see. She did not need him to see it. She only needed him to understand that she was not available. "I'm not selling," she said. "Any of it." He nodded. A small, genuine nod. He looked up at the farmhouse one more time. "It's something, what you've built here," he said. "It took longer than I expected," she said. "Most things do." He got back in a silver sedan and drove back down Hollow Creek Road. Violet watched the car until it disappeared around the first bend. Loretta came to stand beside her without being asked, the way she had learned to be present. "Was that the bank?" Loretta said. "Yes," Violet said. "And not interested." They walked back up the hill together. The October garden around them. The highs quiet in the morning cool. The farmhouse with its repaired roof and its whitewashed walls and the smoke beginning from the chimney she had set a fire in before coming down. The root cellar below with its sealed crocks and its 40 years of someone else's careful knowledge, waiting to be carried forward. In the spring, the first seed-saving classes would begin. May's idea, Loretta's encouragement, and Violet's own intention before either of them named it. People would come down those stone steps and stand before the shelves and read the labels in the careful old handwriting and understand, in the way you understand things that you experience rather than hear about, what it meant to preserve something across the distance of a century. She had something real to teach. She had learned it from a man who had spent 40 years writing it down for whoever came next, and from a husband who had spent 30 years teaching her, without either of them quite knowing it, that the things worth keeping required someone willing to do the keeping. Arthur had known she could do this. He had written it down and hidden it behind a photograph, so she would find it when she was ready rather than before. She had found it when she was ready. She thought of his words as she walked back up the hill with Loretta beside her and the October light flat and gold across the garden and the hives and the 3.1 acres that had cost $7 and everything she had learned about what she was made of. Keep something alive. She was keeping several things alive. She intended to keep going. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.